Hello and welcome to Fuel Poverty Action's series of monthly learning sessions. Fuel for Thought, from fuel poverty to climate justice. Fuel Poverty Action is a group of ordinary people fed up with being robbed by greedy energy companies through spiraling bills and rip-off prepayment meters. We campaign to protect people from fuel poverty. We challenge rip-off energy companies and unfair policies that leave people to endure cold homes, and we take action for warm, well-insulated homes and clean and affordable energy that's under the control of people and communities, not private companies. And here, Fuel for Thought is our space to share research and lived experience, tackle lies, and clear up confusion on fuel poverty and climate change as we ask and answer questions with experts, activists, and campaigners. Surely, I'm sure you are all aware that we have a new government, a new party in power, and so at this session of Fuel for Thought, which is the last one before we take a short summer break for the month of August, we're going to be talking about where we are now and whether change of government actually means change, as they keep repeating, is actually on the way. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Jeremy Gilbert, Professor of Cultural and Political Theory at the University of East London and the current editor of the journal New Foundations. Jeremy has been an advisor to and participant in a range of political projects, including the World Transformed, which some of you might know about, and the new Economy Organisers Network, which is brilliant, and I recommend you check out. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. So can you hear me okay? Okay. Well, the title of the session is same as the old boss. So I'll try and address this question as to, well, what might have changed and what hasn't, particularly from the point of view of FPA's specific interests. So I'm going to think about, well, first I'll think about what generally, what has changed. I mean, what has changed on a broad scale is clearly the political character of the government and the electoral coalition underpinning it. So you have a government which is dependent upon a different set of votes to the old government in ways which is fairly obvious, ways which are fairly obvious. And I'm sure people here don't really need me to spell out. So they are more dependent on the votes of people who work for a living and who are connected with the public sector, and in some cases people who are poor, although not so much really. Poor people just really did not vote in this election at all, to any statistically significant degree. And that indicates some of the ways in which things are really not changed, have not particularly changed, unfortunately, from our perspective. I think it remains the case that even though the party political character of the government has changed, and to some extent its electoral coalition has changed, it remains the case, as was true of the previous government, that the voters they are very concerned about, the voters they are most concerned to please and to retain the support of are basically older homeowners, relatively affluent older homeowners. They're the people who those are disproportionately the kind of people who didn't vote Labour in 2019 and did vote Labour or didn't vote at all in 2024, and the government is still quite dependent on their votes. So that is one factor in the broader context, and that is always going to be something important to think about. In terms of broad areas of policy that are relevant to fuel poverty action, I'm going to talk about three aspects: energy policy generally, attitudes to poverty, and particularly attitudes to pricing and what might happen on those. So firstly, well, what's changed on energy policy? Well, I think it's quite clear that there has been some movement, and I think I'm sure everybody here is probably aware that that on the one hand, the flagship policy is the government's flagship policy is the establishment of an institution called Great British Energy. There's been a great deal of ambiguity as to what exactly British Energy is going to, what British Energy is going to do, what it's going to be for, and the general consensus among close observers and sort of Westminster Kremlinologists or Labour Party Kremlinologists, which I think is pretty accurate, is that there is a sort of maximal version of what GB Energy would be, which is that it would be a publicly owned green energy generation company that would ultimately even to some extent be in competition with others, or at least be in competition with less green energy providers. And there is a completely minimal version of what it would be, which is that it would essentially just be an investment de-risking vehicle. It would be a company that would co-invest with private investors in green energy generation projects, pretty much only for the purpose of making investment on the part of those private investors more attractive to them and less risky. And at the moment, it looks like what they're promising is something in between those two poles, and nobody knows exactly what. Clearly, within the cabinet, there's Ed Miliband, who's the person responsible for energy policy, would clearly be more interested in the more progressive version, and whether it would lead to an actual nationalised energy company, or whether it would be something more like a company, a publicly owned investing company supporting a network of local energy cooperatives, I think is open to interpretation. So you've got Ed Miliband, and he's works quite closely with people like Commonwealth, the think tank, and they would like to do that. On the other hand, that's the kind of extreme left of the politics of the actual cabinet, and further away from that position, you've got people who are clearly pressuring for it to be something much less ambitious, much more in line with the Chancellor's seemingly current approach on public investment, which is that really the purpose of public investment is solely to attract private investment, rather than to actually intervene in markets in a way that would significantly redistribute power within them away from private investors and private profit makers. So that's where we're at there. On the issue of poverty as such, I think clearly we are in a different policy environment now. But even the kind of sort of far right of the Labour Party, which is the people making up most of the cabinet and the government, historically, they do see themselves as concerned with alleviating poverty, especially amongst the most deprived sections of the community. Of course, what they're not interested in is addressing poverty structurally, historically, something which they tend to see as leading down a slippery slope towards unrealistic, utopian, and ineffective forms of policy, how they would see it. So I can see there being considerable scope to push for measures that would would lift the very poorest people out of fuel poverty. But these are likely to this is likely to be very highly targeted if they can. Their preference would be for this to be done in such a way that there is no hint that what is happening is, the power or profitability of the energy generation industry is being in any way curtailed or reduced. And then that finally comes onto the question of, well, pricing. Like, what are they? How likely is it that we could actually get significant action over pricing, given that, for example, when Ed Miliband suggested that energy prices would be capped by the government during the 2015 general election, he was accused of being a Marxist by newspapers, and it's generally, the people now advising the government think that was sort of that led down, that was again the beginning of a slippery slope that led to Corbynism, was something they really didn't like. So I would say it's pretty unlikely. It's also, it would be very, the chance of the Treasury is likely to be pursuing an economic policy which would regard like direct intervention over prices as highly unorthodox and highly dangerous. So that's not to say that conditions couldn't change, but given that inflation generally is now is dramatically reduced, I think we're going to be very lucky to see the government actually being willing to engage in sort of counter market or counter cyclical action on price controls. But I wouldn't entirely rule it out if circumstances change. You know, the countervailing argument to all that is that they are aware that energy companies are extremely unpopular with the public, and that broadly speaking, the public would like to see them nationalised, and thinks that their profits are completely illegitimate. But I would suspect it would be much more typical of this incoming Labour government and their politics. It would be much more typical of them simply to sort of repeat one of New Labour's greatest hits, something like a windfall tax, and using the profits from that to distribute some kind of benefit. They're more likely to do that than they are to actually attack pricing at source. But I'm not at all saying it's impossible for that to happen, but it's much more likely. Okay, that's enough. I think that's enough for now. I've been going on for 9 minutes.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And yeah, please, if you're able, stick around for the discussion part of the session.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is our very own Jonathan Bean, the Fuel Poverty's Actions Policy and Parliament Lead. Jonathan, thanks for being with us.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, thanks, Jeremy. That was really interesting what you just said. I'm going to be touching probably on some of those areas and giving maybe my view on it, and also covering a few different areas as well. So it'll be a bit of overlap and a bit of new stuff. So I think one of the things about the Labour campaign, we don't really know exactly what's going to happen, because obviously there were a lot of really good sound bites, like, we're going to be a clean energy superpower, we're taking back control of our energy. Sometimes you kind of wondered whether Boris was still in government. But the real question is, what is the substance behind these slogans? And maybe a good starting point is to start with the most tangible promise that was made during the election campaign, which was this £300 saving by 2030. Now, unfortunately, if you look at the source of that £300, it was actually based on pricing from last year. And it was a reduction from 2,000 to 1,700. That's actually higher than we are today. We're about at 1,600 currently on energy bills, which itself is 50% higher than it was 4 years ago. So actually, this £300 was pretty misleading, but obviously it was an election campaign, so you kind of expect that to some degree, but it's quite disappointing. So they're starting from a kind of full start point, which is not a great start. We've already got millions of us in fuel poverty. So if it was 1,700, that would actually leave millions of us still in fuel poverty for another 5 years, which would not be good. I think the other thing to think about is, as has already been touched on, the idea that instead of public investment, we're going to be relying a lot on private investment, very much based on Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules. Now, the downside of that, obviously, is that you've then got to add in the profit and also the accumulated interest from this private investment. And energy projects work over, typically a 30-year lifespan. So though that interest cost accumulates massively over those 30 years. So you start off with what should be relatively cheap renewable energy, actually becomes a lot less cheap if you add in private profit and accumulated interest. And as those people familiar with the Blair era of PFI initiatives, these public-private partnership type situations, the eventual cost of those kind of deals over 30 years turned out to be huge, and there's a risk that could also happen in this situation. So that's something we really need to keep a close eye on. So this GB Energy, I think I probably would be more at the minimalist part of the spectrum of what Jeremy was talking about. Certainly, if you listen to what they're saying, that seems to be more the direction it is, but obviously we're going to see and we'll push for much more. If you look at the areas where they say the money will go into, it's really into those areas that private investment is struggling with. So kind of the projects that are struggling, like, for example, tidal, floating offshore wind and nuclear. So yes, they are very much behind nuclear. They're talking about small modular reactors. We all know that all it's an unproven approach, and pretty much all nuclear projects go massively over time and budget, as well as obviously we still 80 years later don't know what to do with all the toxic waste that's created. So it's pretty worrying really that they're putting such a big bet on nuclear. And the idea that you need it for baseload is also potentially a bit flawed, because actually you might be in a situation where if you overinvest in nuclear, you end up actually having to turn down your renewables, switch them off and waste them when demand is low. So it could actually be less efficient, as well as being very expensive. So there's lots and lots of issues around nuclear, and it's worrying that that's being prioritized for the money. Also, our grid will remain a private monopoly, so it's not owned by us anymore. It's still generating billions in dividends for its owners, and those owners are people, investors like BlackRock, and the Abu Dhabi Investment Trust. So that bad situation will continue, and obviously there's been lots of issues about the grid not really being properly managed, just like our water network. So that's not great either. Getting a bit more optimistic, there is some more promising stuff. Maybe the community energy investments could work out to be something positive. Local community groups working with local authorities. That could have a good outcome if it's done right, but a bit of a question about how will they actually work with the private firms that will do the actual building of this of the infrastructure, generating locally. Will they actually get a good deal for bill payers? How many people will actually be benefiting from this? Very unclear at the moment, but bit more optimistic on that front. It's good in theory, but in practice a question mark, and we'll definitely be pushing hard to make sure that goes in the right direction. Then there's also the Warm Homes Plan, which in theory should help fuel poverty. In theory, if you insulate homes, it should bring down bills, but as we know, there's been a whole series of government initiatives in this space that have often had really bad outcomes. For example, the cavity wall insulation damaging people's homes, a lot of cowboy operators, because it's very much relied on the private market to do the delivery, which has been pretty chaotic. So you might get good work, you might get really bad work. And they seem to be in a real hurry. So I'm very concerned that they're not going to be training up lots of people with really good skills, which is what we need. And they're going to be rushing in and relying again on private provision, which again will create a lot of issues with cowboys and bad work. So yeah, a bit of a mixed bag. I suppose a couple of positive things I've seen so far. I mean, Ed Miliband is talking that he's currently in discussion with Ofgem about standing charges, bringing them down. That's something we've campaigned hard for, so at least some reduction in them will be welcome. So that's good. And also talking about taking some of the levies off electricity. Currently, electricity is 4 times more expensive than gas, which is obviously completely insane. So some movement on that would be positive. But overall, I guess, nothing like the radical change that we're definitely fighting for, but some positive signs and some room for optimism, but obviously a lot of work for us still to do to push them to go much further. That's probably enough for now, but we can obviously talk later in questions if we have time.
Thank you very much for that, Jonathan. I really appreciate that bit of depth. Next up, we have Lorraine Inglis, who is I hope I'm saying that right, who's the co-founder of Weald Action Group, which is a collaboration of community anti-drilling groups across the southeast of England. You might have seen them in the news recently because they won a landmark Supreme Court case against Horse Hill oil site for the change of environment impact assessment after a 5-year legal battle. And we're going to hear a little bit more about that and the relevance of it. Lorraine, thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you. Yeah, hi everyone, and thank you, Amal, for inviting me on this webinar. And looking forward to talking about judgment. I volunteered with Fuel Poverty Action many moons ago, so I really value the work that you do. So yeah, I'm Lorraine Inglis. I'm the co-founder of Weald Action Group. It was founded in 2016. I just want to give you a brief history of like the lead up to the case. I've been personally campaigning against the Horse Hill site since 2013, working with various groups like the Horse Hill Protection Group, Factory Surrey, Back Off Horse Hill. Now, Horse Hill is a really small oil site in near Gatwick in Surrey, and the operator, Horse Hill Development Limited, is owned by UK Oil and Gas, and it's a penny share oil company, now known for greatly exaggerating their oil discovery claims. And in 2018, we discovered a scoping document on the Surrey County Council website detailing the next phase of oil production at Horse Hill. And this document highlighted a couple of elements that we felt could be challenged, particularly regarding the UK's net zero commitment. We strongly believe that the environmental impact assessments, the EIAs, I can hear that someone can't hear me very well. Is that the case for everyone? No, okay. All right, I'll continue. Yeah, so we strongly believe that these environmental impact assessments that should include Horse Hill's downstream Scope 3 emissions, as the oil that's drilled from the site would inevitably be burned, producing greenhouse gases. Sorry, I'm still seeing that people sound quite muffled. It could be because I've got my headphones on. I'll continue and hope that it's fine. So yeah, in November 2019, after seeking advice, we engaged solicitors Lee Day and Sarah Finch kindly stepped forward to front the case, and we began crowdfunding, £45,000 through various amazing initiatives throughout our community. But however, in November 2020, High Court Judge Holgate dismissed our application for judicial review. But determined, we pressed on, raised an additional 20,000 and secured grounds for an appeal. And in November 21, Court of Appeal hearing before 3 judges resulted in an unusual split decision, with 2 judges upholding the council's actions as lawful and third, Justice Moylan, agreeing with us that they were not. So with little joy as climate justice campaigners, we appealed again, this time to the Supreme Court. And in June 2022, we had a 2-day hearing, and it was clear that 2 judges were favourable to our arguments, but we needed favourable to our arguments, and we needed 3 out of 5. So almost exactly a year later, June 20th, Midsummer's Day, we entered the court with hope but little expectation. To our absolute shock and delight, the majority judgment ruled that the decision to grant planning permission for the oil project at Horse Hill was unlawful, as the project environmental impact assessment failed to assess the climate impact of burning oil. They also stated that any suggestion that local planning authorities are unable to consider climate change when making plans decisions were misguided. So what started our challenge at Horse Hill, it's 4 new wells and 20 years of oil production turned into something like much bigger. And we reached this point, just through sheer determination, and the efforts of many passionate campaigners. And it was obvious that this case highlighted the ambiguities in current legislation regarding environmental impact assessment. And it provided a strong base for advocating changes that basically prioritise renewable energy over fossil fuels. And it's crazy that we have to go to these lengths to establish our point. I mean, this is not rocket science. So we have already written to Angela Rayner, Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, and Ed Miliband, Secretary of State for the Department, you know who he is, for Energy Security and Net Zero. to urgently bring forward these revised guidance for our planning authorities on EIA's terms for fossil fuel planning applications. It's heartening to note that the government didn't skip a beat and has recognised the errors in the law regarding the decisions to grant planning permission for the coal mine in Whitehaven, Cumbria, and the Biscaythorpe oil site in Lincolnshire. And we hope that it would also see off Rosebank, who is also taking on a legal challenge. So, like everyone, you know, I've listened to both Jeremy and Jonathan here with a lot of stuff that I didn't realise. You know, I've had my head completely in international campaigns. So, like everyone, you know, we hope that this recent change in government is likely to hamper off any new fossil fuel production projects in the UK. You know, the Labour Party was elected on the manifesto to not issue new licences for exploring new oil and gas fields or grant new coal, which is obviously a great step forward. You know, so this ruling is not just a win for campaigners at Horse Hill, but a significant win for climate and our energy future by recognising the need to consider full environmental impacts of fossil fuel projects. This decision does set a precedent that will influence future energy policies and project approvals. With the illegal requirement to account for Scope 3 emissions, it will be increasingly difficult for new fossil fuel projects to gain approval where an EIA is required. So we are hoping that this will significantly reduce the amount of projects and that this has to boost renewable energy investments. Also on an international scale, I came across a Carbon Brief reported last week that our UK court ruling provides ammunition for anti-fossil fuel lawyers worldwide and sets an example that, you know, hopefully can inspire legal challenges globally, and that will accelerate that shift towards renewable energies on an international level. So our victory at Horse Hill, you know, I'm obviously very proud of it, and it is a testament to the power of grassroots activism and the resolve of those that were involved. You know, this decision not only strengthens the climate justice movement and our fight against climate change, but also empowers communities to challenge and dismantle the fossil fuel stranglehold on our energy systems. You know, there is hope on the horizon, and we are hoping that this is the tide that is turning. I will leave it to the discussion to see how this fits in with future Labour policies, but I'm just hoping that we have made a big dent in fossil fuel new projects. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you, Jonathan and Jeremy again. Yeah, we're now going to move swiftly into the second part of the session, where I hand over to everyone else who's here with us this evening to hear, your reactions, reflections, questions and comments, stories also, if you have some. If you want to come in, just raise your virtual hand that you can do by clicking on the three dots at the bottom right of your window. Look for reactions and click raise hand. So that's three dots, look for reactions and click raised hands. You can also type things into the chat. I'll be looking and reading that. And I'm happy to read out your words. A few things maybe before I hand over. There was some discussion in the chat in the discussion board. It'd be great to have in the discussion board on Action Network, that is. So yeah, if that was you, please come on in and say what you had to say. It'd be fantastic to hear you. And also we were meant to have another speaker on housing, give more specifics on housing. Unfortunately couldn't join us. So if you have something to say about an incumbent Labour government and what you expect to see on housing, please come on in, and share your wisdom with us. So I have everyone should be able to unmute themselves, and I'm handing over to our audience here. Steve, please.
Hello, good evening. This is my first time attending Fuel for Thought. Really interested in what I'm hearing, and yes, it's really very important that as people have done. And congratulations for the Weald project. Obviously, that's terrific. I think in the things that have been raised, stick to the points here. Great British Energy, yes, we could be quite positive about that, or optimistic about that, but caution required, I'm sure. It's obviously my hope for it would be that it would at the very least align and control funders and investors to steer the funds in the right policy directions to align with net zero, etc., and the transition up to 2050. So in theory, that should play a part in realigning what they're funding, what they're paying for. Funders have got cold feet over nuclear. They now regard it as being too risky. I've got a long analysis from somebody that I received recently that showed that they're just all getting cold feet, and it's almost impossible for the various players to fund new nuclear. SMRs are dead in the water practically. One of the big players, NewScale, you probably saw recently, they had to cancel out one of their prime products that they were going to bring to market on the basis that they actually technically couldn't make it work. They decided it was too risky and they couldn't do it. So that's not really moving at any pace, and obviously this helps massively because it makes a huge gap, which means that the funders are looking for something more secure. And you didn't mention hydro, Jonathan, or Jeremy, rather, when you were running through your list there. And there's the Corglass project in Scotland, which I believe has now got full funding and full go-ahead, which is a bit like the Nirnwerig one in North Wales, where it basically pumps water to a lake and then drops it, and it goes from like a standing start in the turbine hall from 0 to like 6 gigawatt or something in a matter of seconds. I think it's less than 30 seconds, and obviously that is a good match with periods whenever the generation from wind and solar and so on goes slightly low, and that helps to smooth out those infrequent peaks, massive peaks we get. So, and I think that's something that where the funders will be interested. It's well-known technology. You build it and it lasts for years. Yes, you have to maintain it, but it's not, you don't dismantle it really. You just keep it replacing the equipment. So I think that's a key thing that could well be invested in. There's an Australian guy I saw a report for, did a report, weirdly he was from Australia, but he did a report, I think he was doing most countries, about locations for hydroelectric of that type. We've got a lake in the mountain and a lake at the bottom, pond at the bottom. And you just, when the electricity demand, we've got excess generation, which we should have in future from wind and so on, that will pump the water up to the top lake again. And then whenever we've got times when the electricity just drops it through the turbines. So that's quite interesting. But I think there's a danger though with it. Depends very much. The detail here about Great British Energy is if they're just going to allow a lot of private equity into directly funding and also, most importantly, directly controlling energy companies or energy production or individual invested plant, whatever type, in pockets, that's not going to necessarily work terribly well, of course, because we have had this, the private equity funding of Thames Water and other things in the last couple of decades has proven just to be asset stripping and nothing more, nothing less. It's just purely simply asset stripping. So that is a real danger, I think. The ineffective regulator, again, this is something that if they configure GBE correctly, if they've actually got a joint and a share of the particular measure or a particular power generation they're dealing with or getting involved in, if the government actually has a share, surely that gives them more power than the existing regulators we have that are like a paper tiger and worse. They're just completely ineffective because of that revolving door between the different industries and the regulator that sits alongside it. So that's just a complete, corrupt. Yes, somebody's making extra money somewhere, but it's simply just that revolving door where it's the oil and gas industry controlling the oil and gas regulator. It's Ofgem. It's the telecoms people and Ofgem gas and so on controlling the gas industry, controlling the regulator. So that's all very problematic. And I think somebody mentioned the fact about taxation relief. The imbalances between electricity and gas, that's very important as well. And subsidy is something else you can look at without taking the steps into price caps and so on that was being. We do have price caps, of course. So that's pretty much a principle of reducing prices. Somebody mentioned earlier, but we have that in a way, The windfall tax, a very direct way of dealing with it, really. But the costs and so on, the actual outcome then for individuals is, of course, what has to drive all of this. What are people, paying, and people that really can't afford to pay very much for their energy? What are they actually paying, and how is it being charged? And again, this could be, we know the data, but I'll stop in a second. I'm going on a bit long, probably. The civil services, I've never seen it over 30 years I've been in England, working along with policy people in Desnes and so on, and basis was that they've never been more of a dearth of technical experts in the civil service. And what that means is that whenever the private companies come along and say, we'll do something, we recommend you do this, they all listen, and the politicians listen, because they've got nobody in the middle saying, well, look, that bit's good, but this rest of this is rubbish. They don't have anybody to interpret the technical detail any longer. And they're like a drunk running around looking for his keys under a streetlight, because that's where you can see, the solution doesn't lie there, it lies elsewhere. So they're only seeing what's being brought to them by lobbyists and so on. And that's something we need to break down, of course. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Steve. Just very quickly, Carrie was asking, what is SMR?
Small, medium-sized, yeah, there you go. SMR, small, mobile, modular, sorry, that's the word. Yes, indeed. Modular, SMR, keep calling it SMR. I never have to say it in full anymore. Small modular reactor, yeah. This is it's smoke and mirrors. I always say, and have been saying for a couple of years, that the only movement that they've made in getting these to market is that they've gone from having CGIs to having animated CGIs. That's as far as they've got,
Thank you for that, Steve. Thank you. Yeah, a lot there. Does one of our speakers want to come in to what Steve has said before I move on to Zoe? Yeah, Jonathan.
Well, I thought there were lots of brilliant points there. I totally agree with it. I had one interesting anecdote on your last point, actually, about this lack of expertise in civil service, because I was in a session, the person that was in charge of heat pump rollout in the UK was actually asked about, are there storage tanks as part of the setup? And they actually didn't know this basic question, which is like a fundamental thing that anyone, really should know. So it just shows, there's this real lack of knowledge, and that does really open up to lobbyists from the industry. But some great points there about, definitely hydro, some great stuff going on there. So the points I was making about it was, some of them I think are bad ideas, some of them are ideas that are good but will take time and are not going to be cheap, and therefore the idea that this will reduce bills is what I think was the misleading point. But some really great points in there, but probably too much to unpack without having a little bit more time.
Thanks, Jonathan. Zoe, would you like to come in?
Oh, hi everyone, I'm Zoe. I work for a charity and think tank called Sustainability First, which is focused on fairer and more sustainable energy and water sectors. I guess, share Steve's concerns about the power of lobbying, and a little bit worried that the kind of dominant narrative that is being sold around the kind of decarbonisation of the grid isn't actually going to be accurate, a bit like with the promises that were made around smart meters, which is a much simpler change to make than decarbonising our electricity network. I mean, Labour's committed to decarbonise the electricity grid by 2030. That's not that long away. It's just one, from a grid point of view, it's just, one and a bit price controls. In terms of investment, it will inevitably increase costs in the short term. There's a question as to how those costs will be passed on. The costs are going to increase because there's going to be much greater pressure on the supply chain. Companies are already, saying that certainty is going to be more important to them than competition and shopping around for the cheapest prices. Labour's saying that, it's got a strong narrative on the importance of growth and green jobs, but the harsh reality is we're not going to be able to scale up the workforce to deliver those jobs, to decarbonise the grid in time. So we're not going to see those job benefits either. And I was in a meeting yesterday with DESNers, as they're now catchily called. Still can't quite get used to that one. And one of the known unknowns is, most of you will be aware that next year the way in which pricing works in the energy sector is going to change. So we're something called the changes to half-hourly settlement is going to be introduced, and that means that the way in which energy suppliers will get remunerated will mean that they'll have different profiles, half-hourly profiles. So basically, customers and suppliers will be incentivized to incentivize us to use energy when it's off peak and not when it's peak. So there are going to be a lot of winners and losers from that shift. And it's kind of a known unknown that government and the regulator have absolutely no idea what the scale of the number of people who aren't going to be able to benefit from this new system is going to be, and who really the winners and losers is going to be, because they don't have the data on the distributional impacts of these changes. And I don't get a sense that Labour really get it, that they really understand that actually we're not talking about a small minority of people that might be worse off as a result of this change, but actually this could be even the majority of people that are not able to really participate and benefit from this market. I was in another working group this week where the chief economist of Shell was talking, and I have a tendency to ask a question, will speakers bet their house on the fact that electricity bills will become cheaper, even against a counterfactual of no action, by 2035? And nobody yet has been willing to say, yes, I truly believe that is going to happen. And when I sort of pressed the lady from Shell about it, she said, well, we'll be producing a huge amount of generation, but ultimately that will be sold on the international market. The UK's contribution is a blip, and demand globally is growing. So this idea so I guess my biggest fear, and I'm hoping I'm completely wrong, but my biggest fear is that, we have a huge amount of generation at a cost to a lot of communities where we don't actually see the benefits as Britain PLC, and those benefits don't flow through to individual households and customers. But I do think there's an opportunity to kind of educate Labour backbenchers who I think will care about these issues, and to encourage government to think a bit more about how we can make sure that doesn't happen. And I do think that requires a move away from the kind of market structures we have at the moment, which at present, all the signals we're getting from, Rachel Reeves and Labour are that, I think, as the first speaker said, that Labour aren't going to be open to in the short term. I think they're trying to keep the markets reassured. But I think in the longer term, there will be opportunities. I'm hoping in the long term, there will be opportunities as the backbenchers start to rattle their cages a bit more. So that's my kind of download on it all.
Thank you, Zoe. Brilliant. Thanks for that. Thanks for those insights. Do we have any reactions from Jonathan, Jeremy, Lorraine?
Should I do a very quick one? Again, some really amazing points that probably take too long to talk about. But yeah, definitely this inequality of who's going to get the cheap energy from next year onwards and who's going to get the expensive energy. We're already seeing really worrying signs. If you look at, for example, the pricing of energy to people with Economy 7 versus, say, EV tariffs, it's about 2 times higher for Economy 7 tariffs. So there's already massive inequality, because obviously the energy firms want to target the people who are most profitable, and affluent households with lower debt risk, with bigger consumption, are obviously more attractive customers. So obviously the companies are going to offer them better deals to try and attract them, and less so with lower income groups. So the inequality is obvious. And I think I totally agree there's a huge education job to be done, both with the Labour team and obviously there's lots of new Labour MPs. There's going to be a huge education job with them as well. So I thought that was a great point.
Yes, exactly. There is obviously with the new government a lot of brand new members of parliament, and we're setting up a very small grassroots lobbying group where we feel that we do have to educate the Labour Party in even over our wing. As I said, it's like the planning decision makers in our councils, that all of it's so ambiguous, and so I think it's an important time for us, even though the people that came out of vote was low, for us to actually engage with the MPs that we do have in power, to educate them. I mean, this is, for me, really insightful stuff listening to you, Zoe and Steve. So yeah, I'm going to definitely take this on. But yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I agree with what everybody said. I think I think you'll certainly find MPs biddable on these issues, especially in urban constituencies where they're already feeling a lot of pressure from the Green Party. They're doing much better than people were expecting. I think I think it's also probably going to be necessary to be tactical about how different groups are approached. So people representing sort of northern post-industrial constituencies are going to want to. They're only really going to be interested in how things are going to affect people's bills. Basically, they're not really going to be. They're not particularly interested in the implications of transition. But conversely, probably, in all likelihood, I would think by the next election, the pressure on MPs representing sort of university constituencies, a lot of urban constituencies, a lot of places with a strong Green vote, to very clearly demonstrate their commitment to transition is going to be very, very strong. So I think there is going to be opportunity in all those regards.
Thank you for that. And we have some reaction from Steve in the chat on what Zoe said as well. It was Darren Jones in Labour, who was a regular at the Parliamentary Renewable and Sustainable Energy Group, which is an all-party parliamentary group. I spoke to them once about district heating. I attend when I see it advertised. I hope you will keep that going. Thank you, Zoe. It'd be fantastic to stay in touch. If you don't mind, you put your email in the chat, and we can keep that conversation going. Carrie, you've been waiting for a little while. Sorry for that.
Sorry, my internet connection is really unstable. I'm always so impressed by the speakers on these sessions. They're really, really interesting, really, really good. But the kind of lack of expertise. I used to work for Sheffield City Council, and there was a lot of outsourcing going on. I worked for them between, and it was just so frightening when they contracted out whatever the work was. There wasn't enough expertise within the council itself as regards overseeing what the contracts were about. So they could be sold so many different projects that were unsuccessful, or outsourcing social care, outsourcing all kinds of two things. The community energy investments, we've got something going. There's Sheffield Renewables, and we've got
Kerry keeps breaking up for me, so maybe Kerry, if you want to turn off your camera, that will increase your bandwidth, because we can't hear you.
Yes, thanks for that, Lorraine. Yeah, Carrie, you're really coming in and out. You could also, as well as turning off your camera, you could find the setting which is to switch off incoming video. I'm gonna have more of a look for it. I can't remember where it is right now, and I'll put a note in the chat for you. Ruth, do you want to come in the meantime?
Yeah. I don't know how much it's being said publicly that like so many failures are being built in because the government's refusing to borrow and is instead deciding to go for private finance, and that we're online to have a continuing private finance, a PFI disaster in housing and in energy and in education and in health everywhere, because that's their choice. And on the energy front, I haven't actually been following things because I've been tied up in other stuff just recently. but I don't know what response there is, or if people are just kind of assuming and said, okay, you know, this is the way the Labour Party is now. They're not going to go for anything that's going to work. They're going to do everything through financing with private money, which is actually a recipe for continuing disaster. And I'm not personally sure that it's actually going to be any better than the Tories. Maybe I'm overly pessimistic, but it seems to me like the you know, the logic when you finance things that way is the same whoever's in power. And you know, if it's got a community label on it or whatever it has, if it is actually being financed that way, it's not likely to be substantially different. And I'm wondering, with all the great information that people have here, you know, the nuts and bolts that Zoe spelled out and Steve spelled out, and of course Jonathan and Jeremy have also spelled out, you know, what we can do to put those facts together, like, you know, more of the same, like something to like start from now, making it public what is actually happening, so that we're not you know, I think one of the most hopeful things, and one reason I was very keen for Lorraine, who I know from climate camping way back, to be on tonight, was we're going to be dependent on the courts. You know, if the government is not going to really make any changes, what happens in court is like, who would have known that they could come and rescue us? But it looks like sometimes they can. So, you know, that is a big positive. And I'm wondering also with nuclear, it's very encouraging to hear, was it Steve saying that you know, they're not really going to go for nukes anyway because nobody will invest in it. Good. But if they do, I wonder if some parallel arguments could be made, not the same, because, you know, it's not like they're going to burn it and the damage is done, you know, in the process of generation. But I don't know if they're taking account of things like the waste, you know, the nuclear waste, when they actually do their planning. You know, are there other things that are being left out, like the little detail of how much and how much greenhouse gases are generated by emissions when you burn the stuff? You know, is there a parallel argument there that could be used? I know there's a lot of people campaigning on nukes, and probably they're looking into that, but that's all.
Yes, when we went about our case, because the impact of the environmental impact assessment was quite significant, we had to keep it very detailed just to fossil fuel like developments, because, you know, we really didn't want to come to put the frighten the judges off that it could mean anything like steel, airport expansion, or whatever, you know. So we definitely kept it fossil fuel focused, but it will be interesting to see what these impacts are. And yeah, I mean, to say about fighting it in court, I never thought that when I became climate justice activist that most of my time would be spent raising money for solicitors in fighting stuff in court. And I, you know, and it sometimes justice does prevail, but there is a lot of work that goes into it. And it was unusual to see what Supreme Court judges kind of overruling government policy. And let's hope that that is the way forward, but it's an expensive and laborious route. Yes, yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Lorraine. Jeremy, yeah.
Yeah, I think those are all really good observations people are making. I mean, on the lack of expertise, I think it is striking. I mean, it's a notable feature of the way our whole political culture has shifted since the 1980s, really. That we've seen the development of this professional political class from whom that most MPs are now drawn, a really high number of the new intake are actually like, you know, management consultants and lobbyists already. A large number are also coming from NGOs, some of whom might be politically sympathetic, but they're usually coming from the kind of PR wing of NGOs. You're not looking at people with a lot of policy expertise, almost by definition, to be honest, almost by definition. One of the conditions of entry now into being the kind of person who is, especially the wing of the Labour Party who are currently in control, think of as being the kind of person they want to be an MP. You shouldn't be someone who is seen to have done anything as dangerous as study climate science, or really any kind of science, quite frankly. And never more, or, you know, social science or physical science, or really anything other than finance and marketing. So that is a real I mean, that is a challenge for us. I would say I'm fairly optimistic that given how many of them there are, if we're just talking about the MPs, how many of them are, how young a lot of them are, that there will be just quite a fairly unprecedented situation of just quite a lot of cultural pressure on a lot of people with very little political experience to deliver, you know, for a population, especially among younger people who want very radical change. And I think they probably will be looking for guidance. So I think there will be opportunity. I think in terms of whether this wave of what is effectively a second wave of the private finance initiative can be stopped, I think it has to be challenged. I was talking to a friend about this a couple of days ago, and I said, well, frankly, based on prior experience, I'm not optimistic that it can be stopped at this stage, partly because, you know, the reason why they want to do this level of, you know, private financing is because their judgment, as was the case for Gordon Brown in the new Labour government, their judgment is, on the one hand, people are expecting to see significant improvements to infrastructure across the board in the country, in the public sector and in the private sector, and this government, any Labour government elected under current historical circumstances, probably doesn't really have the kind of political power, the actual power to deliver it in a traditional way, that they'll just get hammered by the press, they'll get hammered by the city and the bond markets, and, you know, if they try to deliver it in a traditionally social democratic way, they would fail. I don't think that's necessarily true, but I do think they genuinely believe that to be true. So under those circumstances, that is their, you know, the reason the pressures on them and the motivations for them to keep pursuing this, I completely agree with Ruth, is ultimately disastrous strategy, quite high. So I'm afraid my perspective on that is that, exactly as Ruth said, actually, the main thing we need to be doing at the moment is at least complaining about it very loudly, because something that happened in the early 2000s with the first wave of Labour PFI is it received very little publicity. It was very much kind of niche campaigning issue. There were a couple of wholly half-hearted trade union campaigns against it. A couple of the you know, far left NGOs picked it up, but it was picked up largely in terms of a broader critique of, there's a Washington consensus, actually. It wasn't really pitched to the British public in terms that made a lot of sense to them. And it was a huge missed opportunity. I mean, I'm always telling the story. I always love telling the story of the time I was doing a French class at the Institute Français in South Kensington on a Friday afternoon in the early 2000s. So the class consisted of me and a bunch of like affluent Tory ladies. But because it was a French class, they even in a fairly basic French class, they wanted us to talk about politics. And at one point, I started telling them about the PFI and about things like how the exam service was going to be privatised, and they were really horrified. And they were quite clear. They said, "This isn't what people voted for. And nobody wants this. Even you know, sort of traditional Tories who aren't kind of wild-eyed libertarians didn't want it. But nobody wanted it. But it just wasn't publicised." And you can already see what's happening is that the Guardian would report that stuff, but they drop it down to page 7, page 8, and they're doing it already. You can see this week, this kind of thing. The fact that they are going to carry on engaging in an economic strategy, which is going to just keep consolidating the power of massive corporations and massive accountancy firms, it'll be there in the paper, but it'll be page 7. Like, it won't be in the headlines, it won't be in the notifications people get on their phones. So it absolutely is imperative on us to make a noise about it, to keep complaining about it, so that when it starts to fall apart, there's at least a reasonable chance that the beneficiaries of that are not just, you know, the far right, frankly, who will do even more of it, but some political project which will actually claim to do even more of it. I hope we can ultimately oppose it. I mean, things are very unstable at the moment, and it's clear. I think it's very important to understand the unions really don't want it. They didn't really want it last time. And the unions, the big union leaderships, were far more compliant with New Labour than they are with this Labour leadership. So the unions really don't want it. And the unions could be pushed. And I think that it would be one circumstance which could give us a chance of actually slowing it down or even halting it, is if there was a significant convergence between civil society, NGO, sort of voluntary sector organisations and the unions around this issue. If we signal to the unions that we're willing to support them if they really step up their opposition to it, then I think there is an opportunity. There is really an opportunity, actually. But either way, whether we can succeed in stopping it now or not, that we do need to really make a noise about it, because I think Ruth's analysis is completely accurate. It will be a disaster. It has been a disaster. It is demonstrably a disaster. You know, the policy they are now proposing to extend has demonstrably been a disaster for the past 20 years. So, but people just don't know about it. People just don't know that it's happened, and even though they absolutely don't want it and didn't vote for it. So I think we do. There's every reason for us to push and push and push on why it's about, on first just that it's happening, and secondly that it's bad.
Thank you for that. Yeah, daunting. I feel heavy from all this talk about private investment. I guess that's maybe what we should be, what I should be feeling. A quick follow-up question on this actually is, I mean, how long do we have really before these contracts start coming in? Yeah, is there a time scale? Anyone have any ideas about that?
Not very long, I would guess. I mean,
I mean, a lot of
they'll start very soon.
Early next year, I think.
But they'll carry on. I mean, there's no chance of stopping the first tranche, I think. But they're going to keep issuing these contracts like every month, every week, like forever. So in another way, we have all the time in the world to eventually stop them doing it, because they're not going to stop. They're not going to stop doing it and like leave us in a position of having waited too long. They're just going to keep doing it.
Yeah, of course.
How much do people think everybody remembers PFI and what a disaster it was? You know, is that something we can refer people back to? I know young people won't. They won't remember really.
I don't think most
well,
people. Most people, I think, don't know. Just have never really known about it.
Right.
I think it's one of those areas. I think it's one of those policy areas where if you tell people about it, it makes sense to them, but it fits with their sort of ambient sense that things just haven't really been going the way they thought they wanted them to go. But the details, people really don't know the details at all, apart from like real, you know, very committed like political people.
Sorry, can I cut in now, because I'm in a room where I'm near the router. There's a very good woman called Helen Mercer who is very hot on PFIs, and she did a very good little booklet with graphics explaining exactly how it worked. And I live right next door to the Northern General Hospital, which had all kind of PFI contracts to do with building new wings. And there were some young medical students who really, really picked up on it. So, you know, and they would bring it up from time to time. So I do think there's certain people, but it's just little pockets. But I mean, there is awareness. But yeah, like you say, if it's page 8 on The Guardian, hopeless. Try the Morning Star. We'll get in the front page of the Morning Star. But yeah.
Thank you, Carrie. Carrie, your internet's great now. Do you wanna come back in and say what you had to say earlier?
So we've got this weekend you know, the world transformed, which happened during the Labour Party conferences, ran alongside it, and they're now not. This is the first year, and there was this kind of farewell to the world transformed article in the Morning Star yesterday, which was quite interesting because it was saying it was a bit kind of rudderless because it wasn't rooted in any kind of policy and procedure and where was it going and kind of what influence did it have. It wasn't that democratic, but it spawned lots of Bristol transformed, and we've got a Sheffield transform that's been running for a couple of years. So there's I'm on the Sheffield Trades Council, and we've got a slot about discussing the kind of strike wave and what successes and what might have made better successes. Anyway, but and we've got a union stall. But two of the workshops that I'm interested in, one is to do with land ownership, and the other is to do with community energy projects, which I think is interesting because there's been a Sheffield Renewables, which has been on the go for quite some time. So and there are, yes, I've been to various workshops recently, so I mean that is a possibility, but that's all kind of, I mean, it's terrific if enough places were doing it, but otherwise it becomes a bit piecemeal way of approaching it. But at least it's a way of approaching it and showing there's an alternative. And the hydroelectric, yes, I come from Scotland, and there's during the 50s, the whole hydroelectric, I can't remember his name, it was a Labour Party guy who was going to revive the economy of the Highlands after the Highland clearances 200 years before. But he was going to, you know, he thought if he could bring, do all these hydroelectric schemes, and there's some incredibly impressive ones, but you do need quite steep hills and a lot of water. But yes, excellent.
Thank you, Carrie. And you had a question as well. In the chat, Carrie wrote, Jeremy, do you mean the Great British?
Sorry, I just cut in at the point when he was saying oppose, 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 and I thought quite specifically, do you mean just the whole Labour project of the Great Energy Company, British Energy or whatever?
No, I don't mean to. No, I mean the reliance on private finance, and in particular what it looks like they're going to do, which is really they're going to use public money to, you know, encourage people, the private sector, to invest in areas of infrastructure that, you know, most people would rather were publicly owned, but they're not going to be publicly owned. I mean, a point that's been made by some people is it's not. I mean, I keep using this phrase for PFI as if they're the same thing, but it's not even really PFI what they're talking about. What they're talking about isn't. What they're talking about is they're talking about just effectively using government money to de-risk and to encourage private investment. But there's going to be no question that the private investment is going to lead to privately owned assets. It's not going to be private companies building assets as the public sector then leases off them. It's going to be the private sector building assets that the private sector just owns. So anyway, yeah. Jonathan wanted to come in.
Yeah, there's also an added risk in this situation, unlike with the schools and hospital PFI issues, that when you're trying to make it attractive for private investors, you obviously are, one, throwing public money in, and secondly, what you're doing is you're regulating and pricing things in a way that make it profitable for the company investing, which then puts up bills. Because obviously the more expensive the energy, the more attractive it is to invest in it. So you actually, there's kind of a double whammy going on. You're using public money to create private assets, and then you're regulating it in a way that ends up with high bills as well. So that's an added problem.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jonathan.
It's interesting that the reason why the whole justification for profit is that these are people who are taking a risk. You know, if you ask anybody, if you ask the economists, why should they make money off their businesses? Well, they're taking a risk with their money, but they're not.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the risk is going to be removed, and they're going to be allowed to keep all the profit. So, which indeed, given that is the source of the high prices, it's not going to affect it.
Yeah, that sounds very dangerous. Steve, you want to come in?
Yeah, I think there's also an element here where private finance actually will invest in all of these industries. And it's a bit of a ruse, really, to to allow it to become PFI, or there's enough risk. The only thing it has enough risk to require public money, as far as I'm concerned, is nuclear. The vast sums of money, they're talking 20 billion plus 26 billion or something now for Hinkley. The hydropower station I mentioned is about 1.5 billion at the moment. Obviously, it's a smaller output and so on, but it's a very essential part of the mix to have that rapid ramp up of supply of electricity on demand, in terms of either outages on the grid, or in terms of increases in demand and flattening it for use of wind and solar and so on. So yeah, it's a tricky one. The original PFI, I was involved in some of those and construction side of things, and it did take quite a while to do the deals, but that was in the early days, whenever nobody knew what the contracts needed to look like. So it was very cumbersome to put together and very expensive legally to put those deals together. But I guess the devil's in the detail, as usual. I think what as Jeremy pointed out originally at the start, what do they really mean, and what contract formats and structures have they got in mind when they're talking about GBE? And that, I don't believe any of that's really crystallized yet. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Steve. Yes, Ruth?
Yeah, I think the risk thing is actually worth pursuing, because people, the ones who are taking a risk is us. When you have like a heat network and people are locked into a paying back an investment that somebody has made in a scheme that's supposed to heat their housing estate or their block for 50 years, and the thing doesn't work, and the energy is phenomenally expensive because it wasn't done right in the first place. The risk is borne by the bill payer and the cold children. And it's a frustrating thing that we're saying these things that are simple and true, and we're saying them in a room of 12 to 14 people at the moment. And I know it can go further, in that we broadcast it and so on. But just thinking about Jeremy's point about oppose, I raised that, and I do agree with it. But the question is how. What form can even the people in this room now use to assemble our common knowledge and make it more public? Because nobody has told me, oh, that's okay, that's what Navarra is saying. Is it? I doubt it. Maybe I'm just missing it. Maybe other people are shouting this from the rooftop, but I haven't heard it. But I might not have heard because I didn't have my headphones on.
Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, does anyone want to come in on that? Yeah, how can we come together to oppose it? What feels powerful? Gary.
Well, I mean, somebody mentioned the unions, didn't they? I mean, if the main points and the main dangers from people's experience from over the last 30 years, if it could be kind of summed up in the form of a statement or a motion or a something, it could then be put round all the trades councils to discuss with different sectors. It's a start. I mean, if we're talking about influencing bodies of people, and people have talked about unions, and people have talked about the unions having kind of dropped quite considerably their funding for the Labour Party over the last in the last period. I think it'd be really good if the depth of people's knowledge and understanding could be compressed into an A4 statement or something that could then be used by unions or trades councils, and at least it could be circulated to a wider audience and discussed. I mean, we have monthly meetings, and actually there's so many issues coming up at the minute that I think we're going to have to. Sheffield Trades Council is quite a successful trades council as trades councils go, but But, you know, I know about housing because I used to work in housing. I campaigned around public sector housing, retaining public sector, defending council housing. And it is defending the public sector, isn't it? And I think there needs to be, I mean, I think we need a subgroup. We've had a kind of motion from Unite Community about getting together a series of workshops on the climate jobs book, which covers all kinds of things about energy generation, about the built environment, etc., etc. And that's not quite taken off yet. But I do think if it was condensed in some kind of format that could be up for discussion by trade union groups, you know, the kind of 5, 6, however many key points, then that at least would be a kind of start of putting it out into circulation.
Thanks, Carrie. Jennifer, I wanted to bring you in. Was this? Did you want to come in on this discussion?
Well, I wanted to come in really on the horror I feel when I see what Rachel Reeves is proposing. I share that with other people. I don't know if you've seen an article by Anne Pettifor. I think it came out yesterday or the day before. And in it, she describes how Rachel Reeves wants to de-risk entrepreneurship. So socializing the risk of capital again. And I think it's desperately worrying. She is so ignorant of how the economy works. I cannot believe it. And I simply don't know how we get this message over. What do we do when the Chancellor of the Exchequer, in cahoots with the Bank of England, who are perfectly happy to go along with this kind of thing, it fits their mantra perfectly. When people, you know, the Chancellor of the Exchequer is saying these things, what can we do? It's desperately dangerous.
Thank you, Jennifer. Steve, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, thanks. The first thing I was going to mention was that we have got a lot of pockets of support and all of these things. I'm in an energy policy research group called Claverton. We have about 130 people who are all technical experts. A lot of them have designed parts of National Grid, for example. They're technical experts on the methodologies by which we will achieve decarbonisation just using wind and solar, and what the mechanisms in the grid that can allow that are. And people from all other aspects, some people interested in heat pump and domestic, some people, you know, other types of technology, wind turbines and all sorts. And across the piece, all of these people are talking the way we are. So this is the insider experts talking and saying the same things that we are about the format of the grid and how the investment should work. And, you know, it's all there. There are a lot of academics in that group as well, actually. And so that's just one point, really. We shouldn't think that there's not a lot of people. The problem is that the MSN gives us absolutely no voice. It's a substantial number of people that are all thinking like this, but we don't get linked up because it's kind of blocked. There's such a massive negative, you know, impression being created for the average person who just gets their information from the MSN that it's an almost impossible hill to climb to just turn that around and push it out of the way. But you know, that's one thing. And the de-risking entrepreneurship, I mean, this is just arrant nonsense. You know, the nature of entrepreneurship is it's risky. And many's a so-called, you know, rags to riches billionaire, you know, lost twice what they currently have to get to where they ended up. You know, that's lost other people's money and sunk on crazy fringe schemes, and then they get lucky on one. And that was a guy who's at the very top of UK industry told me that after decades and decades. Is one of my neighbours, and he was like right at the top of corporate industry. And in fact, he was in the trade association. He was a chair of the trade association at one point. And that was what he said about the entrepreneurs. I said, well, what people who are very successful, what distinguished them? And he said it was just they were crazy and they were prepared to take risks that other people weren't prepared to take, which meant they took loads of hits. So that just doesn't sit with this capitalist idea of how business and corporatism works in any shape or form. So I also don't see how, you know, we said de-risk it. Well, obviously then it goes on the taxpayer, as we've talked earlier. So that's just the opposite of really where that risk should lie. people are making personal gain. Well, will they really embed in that kind of approach? Will they really embed sufficient return for the taxpayer and the public purse? I'm not sure they will. And I think I posted on put a note on the chat about they need to have a minimum of 51%. If the government is investing large scale in individual projects, they need to own 51% of the scheme. Now the funders are going to go, oh, that doesn't work for us. Well, pay to play, pay or this doesn't happen. But I don't think they're strong enough to do that. They'll just roll over at the first hurdle, and the funders and so on will own a bigger proportion of the schemes in the public purse, irrespective of what money they put in. So yeah, it's all really difficult. But I think there are pockets of people that support all of this and are thinking the same way, but they're just not linked up as a problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, Jennifer, I'm going to bring you in, but I also want to do a little time check. I think after Jennifer, maybe one final point. We'll close and in the final board from Ruth, we'll close the session. Jennifer.
I just wanted to add that Rachel Reeves is working with BlackRock. She talks about them. BlackRock has access to trillions of dollars, but it only owns about 9 billion worth of dollars. That means it's totally unaccountable. It can do all sorts of things and get involved in all sorts of projects, but it is completely unaccountable because it never has to hit the bottom line. It's insured against everything. Rachel Reeves wants to expand that model by what she calls de-risking capitalism. It's just got to be stopped.
Thank you, Jennifer. Ruth?
I like Kerry's idea. I don't know if other people here do. I mean, if it's going to happen, it would need people actually coming forward to work on a statement like that. And seeing, who could start it off, that's hopefully would include fuel poverty action, but not just fuel poverty action. And we'd have to think about whether we would just focus on the energy field, or whether we talk about, for instance, health at the same time, and housing. But it's not everything. The trade unions can't do everything, but it is something. I think it's a good starting point. I don't know, maybe people could wave a hand in the air or something like we used to do, if you if you agree, and if you might like to help with it. As Jonathan and Kerry, anybody else?
Can I just get the name of Steve? Steve, what was the name of the group that you're part of with all the tech experts? Thank you.
I just posted it. Yeah. Cleveland Energy Policy Group, Cleveland Energy Research Group. Yeah. If you look into that, you'll find a lot, and there's a lot of people on Cleverton who publish really, really interesting energy policy stuff across the board. I've got so many links of all this kind of stuff that's really the underneath the polished kind of stuff that's going on in the different energy sectors. I'll have the next layer of stuff where the actualities of what's happening. So yeah, I'll try and build up a list and circulate that to people. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
So
Sorry, Ruth.
Steve, Zoe, Jennifer all put in ideas, and Jeremy, of course, as well as those of us already in FPA, all put in points on this. Do any of you want to help draw something up?
Yeah, Cleverton actually did this, Ruth. We've had articles in the Guardian and stuff, but again, it's just a tiny amount of information to counteract the huge lobby lobbying industry and from all of these energy companies. Yeah.
Yeah, but Kerry's idea of taking it to the trade unions as a sort of statement to go around their meetings and stuff does sound like a way.
Absolutely. They seem
to-
to hold, though, when it comes to things like nuclear, if there's a massive number of jobs they perceive available in a certain area, they're pro-nuclear. They don't really seem to hang or to look too long at the policy overarching strategic issues about whether it's good for the environment, not good for the environment. They're very jobs focused. I find that's quite often where they're.
There is a kind of counterbalance within those unions, GMB and Unite. There is a counterbalance to the argument.
Jeremy wants to come in.
No. Sorry.
Jeremy, what do you think about that proposal?
Yeah, it sounds very good. Yeah, it's a good idea.
Would you help?
Well, yeah, if you would. I think you're perfectly capable of doing it without my help, but I'm happy to if you want me to.
Thanks for that. Jonathan.
I was going to suggest maybe, shall I set up some kind of follow-up session to work on this and see who is able to help us work on this? I mean, I really like the idea of also plugging in more of the experts into this, because that's definitely a huge hole in government and in Labour knowledge, as we've said already, and hugely important. And there's such great knowledge that different people have within this group, and obviously the people that people here know. So I think we could probably pull together some, really powerful materials, and unions is one outlet. Obviously, there's the work within Parliament as well to try and win over some of these, new MPs and just spread this knowledge in a number of different ways. But I'm just wondering, if we could set up maybe a initial follow-up meeting, that would be, I think, really useful. Have you got everyone's contacts, Amal?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Christopher stuck a thumb up as well. Does that mean you're interested, Christopher? No, thumb's invisible now.
It's a yes,
Yes.
from Christopher.
Okay.
Yeah, and we could also think about doing a fuel for thought session on it. Potentially even a fuel for thought that then becomes more of a mobilizing, actual becoming a working group sort of call. That'd be my suggestion. Also, if people have good links, or articles, any resources that you have on anything we've spoken about this evening, please send them over. If not in the chat, then to my email, which I can put in the chat now, and I can include those in the follow-up email, in the follow-up mailing for the session, which won't only go to you, but will go to the whole of Fuel Poverty Action's 4,000 strong mailing list. Unless does anyone else have any burning contributions they want to?
No, I apologise. I can't put myself forward. My capacity is as Weald Action Group is not the only thing that I do, and I'd love to get involved, but I'm afraid I can't clone myself. So
that's fine. No,
but I would
no
love
obligation.
to see some of the output from this. This has been really insightful.
Thank you, Lorraine. In that case, I'm going to close the session. Thank you, everyone, for coming, listening, participating, and thank you again to our speakers for your part in making this so informative and insightful. As you know, we're campaigning at Fuel Poverty Action for every household to be guaranteed enough energy to cover needs like adequate heating, lighting, cooking, and access to medical or mobility aids. And we do that through our Energy for All campaign. You can take action on that by signing our manifesto, which I'm going to link below. And please also let us know how you found the session in a little feedback form that I'm also going to include in the chat here. And let's say good evening. If everyone would like to unmute themselves, open up their cameras, give us a wave
Thank you very much.
Excellent.
Excellent.
Thanks. Right.
Well
Before you
chaired
unplug,
as ever.
Steve, before you unplug, if you could maybe just do 2 minutes with me and Ruth on